Welcome to Emphasis Added, a podcast by the Houston Law Review, where we highlight legal issues with prominent lawyers and discuss the study and practice of law. I'm your host, Kevin Donovan. I'm here today with energy law professor James Coleman at Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law. Professor Coleman, you've been teaching in energy regulatory law for over a decade now, have published numerous scholarly articles on North American energy companies, and you also have a blog that you publish, the Energy Law Professor blog at energylawprof.com. So welcome to the show, James.
It's wonderful to be here. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, and today we will be talking about electricity reliability in Texas, especially in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, or the freeze, the blackouts, whatever you want to call them, whatever the news has been calling them. A lot has happened since then in the aftermath of that, and so really looking forward to talking about what happened during that, and then also what has happened in the aftermath and what the Texas government perhaps is planning on doing about it.
Great.
Excellent. But before we get into all that, I would love to first ask this opening question, a little more personal of a question, but about your experience during Winter Storm Uri. Where were you, and did you have power?
I was at home, and no, we didn't have power. So I was the night of Valentine's Day, and you woke up in the middle of the night, power was out. I had notifications on my phone. I have the ERCOT app, so I definitely get and notifications when they're going through an energy emergency. And no, the power was out. And I remember the very first thing I worried about was, oh no, if the power is going to be out for a while, is the food in my fridge going to go bad? After the power had been out for 7 hours, the temperature in my house was down to 37 degrees.
Yep.
And so I was no longer worried about the food going bad because of heat. My concern was anything liquid in the house was going to explode. So it was quite an experience. Basically, for those first couple days, it was 7, 8, 10 hours of power off, and then maybe 30 or 45 minutes of power on. Temperature in the house got down to 37 a couple times. And so basically that meant if you had power for 30 minutes, run every possible heat source you could, boil water so you'd have something warm to get you through
something to
those
drink.
next seven
depending
hours.
on where you were.
Exactly. So it was, we never actually, our water stayed on.
Really?
I'm in
Okay.
Dallas in the city. And so I know some of the towns around there had water treatment problems.
Yes.
But Dallas, we kept our water. But it was quite an experience. As somebody who grew up in Minnesota, and actually I came to SMU from the University of Calgary. I've been in a lot of cold weather, but I've never been in that kind of situation without power before.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm from Massachusetts, and I go skiing a lot. And so I've been able to control being in the cold, but not knowing when you're gonna have fresh water again or electricity. For me, I was in Houston, and I actually had power, so opposite, but didn't have running water for most of it.
Okay.
And I remember friends and family in the area would contact me hey man, I can see my breath, and I'm like, oh, I have power, come over. And so we ended up having some refugees for all of it, a couple people, a couple dogs. And before the water went completely out, my neighbor contacted me, and we filled everything we could with water. And then people started calling me Conservation Kevin because I would only let them use water for certain things. And we barely made it.
Wow, triage.
Yeah. And so I remember during that and in the aftermath of that, I have a good friend that is into energy, electricity regulation, RJ Caldwell. And so I'd asked him about it, and he had mentioned your name. He said, look up Professor James Coleman. And so I did. I listened. You did a podcast with the Fourth Branch, their Explainer podcast. I think you did a series of lectures. So if you all are trying to listen to things like that happening in the immediate aftermath and get to hear the explanation of that's a good place to go. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the before and the during, and then we'll also be focusing on the aftermath and what hopefully we're going to be doing to solve that. But before we get into all that, I would love to talk first about Texas's regulatory structure leading up to and during the storm. So I know on the news, and a lot of people were pointing fingers at Texas. They have their own grid. They were asking for this, or things of that nature. And so I'd love to know, why does Texas have its own grid?
Well, I think the basic answer is Texas is a huge state.
Yeah,
If it was, it's bigger than Spain, it's bigger than France, other places that have their own grid. So it's not really an unusual size to have its own grid. I think it seems odd when people say, oh, well, Texas, this one state has its own grid. Well, Alaska has its own grid. Hawaii has its own grid. This is a much bigger in terms of the amount of users served because Texas is such a huge state. So from an international perspective, not really odd that it would have its own grid.
Right.
Now, you might say, well, but sure, maybe it's normal to have a grid for a state of that size, but why not plug in to those two interconnections, the eastern interconnection or the western interconnection? I think that you grew up historically for a number of reasons, in the early history of electricity generation, but certainly if you look more recently, one of the reasons we don't interconnect is because people want to preserve state regulation of the power grid. The federal government, controls interstate transmission, interstate power sales, wholesale sales, and so there has been a reluctance to have too much federal control over Texas's power grid. And I think that there are costs and benefits anytime you have a state that's able to pursue a little bit more of its own policy. And that's something that we see a lot of times in energy policy. For instance, California has a pretty unique ability to adopt its own standards for automobiles, for their emissions. And so I think Texas is a little bit jealous of its prerogative to regulate its own electricity system.
Yeah, and what are maybe just one or two of those advantages or disadvantages of being on its own grid? I mean, I suppose that an easy disadvantage is you can't, those outer areas can't connect if in the case of an emergency or something like we saw. But what's maybe like a concrete advantage is why Texas wants this, being able to choose its own regulation?
Well, one concrete advantage is, Texas has far more wind power than any other state. Right. I mean, it's about 3 times as much wind power. It's adding 3 times as much solar. It does a lot of those things. And some of that has been enabled by transmission that basically we all paid for. And so we have these power lines that allow us to bring wind power in from West Texas. And the financing for those is a little bit simpler than it would be if you had a federal system. In a federal system, then FERC has regulation, and the courts have basically said, well, you have to be really careful about ensuring that only the customers that are really getting a benefit from that service pay for it, and that at times makes it hard to finance those things. So we have a flexibility to address sort of new challenges more quickly that comes from having, not these 2 layers of regulation, the state regulation and federal regulation, but really we can do a lot of things just as the state. And so I think historically, one of the big advantages was seeing that we were able to integrate a lot of wind power and renewable power that way. There's also just a constant fight between federal and state policy in other states about when you're supporting certain energy resources, does that go against FERC policy? That's a whole mess, and we basically avoid that. So there are a number of things. I think sometimes people think that it must be the reason we want our own regulation is because we have this cowboy attitude that we just don't like the federal government, and there's some of that. But to a certain extent it's wind power cowboys, right? It's some of the newer energy sources that we're looking to that are cleaner that benefit to some extent from that. So it's a little bit more complicated than it would first appear. I think it's also important to say that in this particular storm, and we'll get to this, but it's not 100% clear how much we would have benefited from that, because if you look at where there were power outages, in our neighbors just to the east and just to the north, there were power outages as well. So to the west did a little better, but it's not clear that there was a lot of power for us to be gained from our nearby neighbors.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point I actually hadn't thought about till now. Is it's kind of almost like what Justice O'Connor said in another context, but like Texas is almost able to be that Brandeis laboratory that with things like wind power or other things where they can we can go ahead and maybe be a little bit more aggressive or a little more forward with some policies. And I mean, the rest of the country can benefit, right? If Texas, does something with wind power that works out really well, then places that are under first control or authority get to benefit by moving that stuff through, I think, faster. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, if you look at the response to the storm, I mean, although there was a lot of writing about, well, shouldn't we integrate Texas with the rest of it? And there are theoretical advantages. I mean, if there's low-cost power somewhere else, great to import it, even apart from reliability concerns like the storm. But there was pretty bipartisan resistance to that across Texas. So I'm just not sure that that's likely to change. It seems Texas is very happy having a little freedom to adopt its own energy policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about things that seemingly came up a lot in the news, Texas's own grid. Another big actor that you heard about a lot was ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Mm-hmm. And so maybe why were they getting the finger pointed at them? Who are they? What's their job?
Well, they're responsible for reliability of electricity in Texas, and so that obviously put them in the hot seat. They're the one that's supposed to make sure the power doesn't go out. Now, they're not providing the power because, of course, Texas has a system where we've introduced competition into the system, and we have independent power providers providing the power. So really, they're just making the market, right? They have the people who want power telling them how much power they would like, and then they have the power providers saying that how much power they're willing to provide at what price, and they basically tell those power providers whether to run based on whether their power is needed at the price that they're willing to offer it. And so, of course, I say that as though there's somebody on the phone with a whiteboard doing this. In fact, it's done, by computers, 15-minute increments, et cetera. So it's not, it's an automated process, but they're the ones that are supposed to do that to ensure that this power never goes out. And they have a number of rules that are basically designed to ensure that power doesn't go out. And obviously those failed in February.
Right, and that's in that side of being like a grid regulator, right? Why is that necessary? What happens if there's too much power or not enough? What is the importance of that?
So electricity is very tricky. There's a number of things that make it tricky. I mean, one thing is that it is very expensive and difficult to store. So first approximation, the power grid has to exactly match how much power is demanded from all 30 million people in Texas every time that they flip on a switch, plug in their laptop or iPhone, start running the dishwasher, the AC flips on. The power grid has to respond to all those and provide exactly the right amount of power.
Which called me naive. I had no idea about that until we had a blackout, and then I quickly learned that apparently that's what we
exactly.
do.
And it's a challenge because if they provide, and I think people don't always realize this, they can't provide too much power either because basically everything connected to the grid would malfunction if you provide too much power, and everything connected to the grid will malfunction if you provide too little power. So there's very, very little tolerance. You have to provide that. And so obviously that takes a number of tools. You have to have some, idea of, are we going to need more power at night or in the morning or with this kind of weather system or that kind of weather system. And so, of course, they have access to vast data to do that, but to do that perfectly is a very difficult process. And there's the other thing that really makes it challenging is it's very easy to get caught in a vicious cycle. So there's some positive feedback loops that can quickly take the grid down. So one of those feedback loops is that basically the reason you have to maintain exactly the right amount of power is because that's what keeps the frequency of the grid where it should be at 60 hertz, which is 60 cycles per second. We know that the power grid is AC as opposed to DC. It's alternating current. So it's alternating 60 times per second. Now, if that gets a little too high or a little too low, everything connected to the grid breaks. And that unfortunately includes the machines the power plants that are feeding the grid. So you can imagine if we don't have quite enough power, then all of a sudden all those power plants that were supposed to provide us with power trip off and are no longer providing power. So that's one feedback loop that can quickly take the grid completely down to zero, which can take weeks or months to recover from. So that's one danger that they're constantly worried about. The second danger is that the power system, all of our supply chains that provide us with power, power plants themselves, the natural gas pipelines that go to those power plants, the pumps in the field that are producing natural gas, the pumps at the storage facilities that store natural gas. Most of those run on electric power. So if power at any point goes down to them, that means that there is no supply chain leading to that power plant that's providing the system. So again, you get this positive reinforcement, this vicious cycle that takes down the entire grid. And so it's a real balancing act. And normally we don't have to think about it, and it's normally done very well. But in this instance, it was not done well.
And so what are ERCOT's responsibilities in the time of a power emergency, like we saw?
Well, there's a couple of things. They issue seasonal forecasts because in Texas, those are really market actors saying, I want this much power and I'm willing to provide this much power at this price. And so ensuring that there's always somebody willing to provide that power, you could just say, okay, well, let's surely the market will work itself out.
Yeah.
The problem is if the market doesn't work itself out, there will be catastrophic harm for everybody, especially with these kind of vicious cycles.
Yes.
So ERCOT doesn't do that. So instead, they do a number of things to try and ensure that there's sufficient power. I mean, one thing that actually is very important, although it may seem like it's not exactly a hard law or regulation, is simply forecasting how much power will be needed in the future. Because when any energy provider is thinking, any power provider is thinking, should I build a new power plant?
Yeah.
They're thinking, is there going to be a need for more power than all the power plants already provide this winter, next summer,
Makes
3 years from now, right? And so where do they go for that information? Well, they could study it themselves, but often something they look at very carefully is what did ERCOT say about how much power is going to be demanded. And so ERCOT does, projections, far into the future, but also, before any season. So before this winter, they had a projection of how much power would be demanded, and unfortunately, it was very inaccurate. They thought we were going to need far less power than it turned out we did, and so maybe for that reason, that power plants weren't as ready to provide power. They didn't think they would necessarily be called upon. So that's one important thing it does.
Right.
But there's a lot of other important things it does. So one other thing that it does is it actually adds a booster to prices when prices are high. So it does the normal thing of calculating, okay, well, how much power do we need to meet this level of demand? And let's take the low cost supplies, right? Now, obviously, as you start using up all the power that could possibly be provided, that price elevates, right? They're using that to set the price in the market. But this may be a little counterintuitive. But when prices get high, they actually boost prices even further. And the reason for that is they said, if we just use the market price, what we find is companies typically aren't willing to invest in a resource that's only going to be used at the very top of the market unless they know they're going to really make a lot of money if it gets to that. And so it's our gasoline market works really pretty well. Right? And so if there's more gasoline available, the prices fall. We might have $2 gasoline. If there's less, prices rise. It might be $3 gasoline. But imagine for power that, you show up, there's a real shortage of gasoline. Gasoline prices have gotten to $4 a gallon. After you fill up, you get home, the gas station sends you a bill, says, I'm sorry, the regulator said I need to be paid $5 a gallon now instead of $4 because I need an incentive to be available in that gas crunch, right? And I mean, to a certain extent, that's counterintuitive, but you can see how it encourages people to invest, to provide, make absolutely sure they have enough gasoline when the crunch comes. And so it means people invest in extra storage for gasoline. Yeah. They make sure their supply chain is locked down. They're not going to run out if there's a hurricane or some other kind of crisis. And so that's the idea of the power. So is it to add that price supplement, that price adder during those periods, those crunch periods. So that's a second thing they do. And they had that going into this. And as a result, and we can talk more about this, but the companies that were able to provide power or, provide natural gas could make a lot of money, potentially. Right. Okay. Then the third thing that they do is when the actual crisis comes and we really simply don't have enough power for the grid, right? I mean, we shouldn't go over because they can just tell power plants, don't run now, right? But sometimes we go under and the reason for that is that, there's just not enough power available, even if we run everyone. Now, they've already added the price adder. So really anybody who could possibly run is trying to run in this circumstance. Usually, at that point, they can start turning off. They can start ordering the companies that actually provide power to households around the state to actually cut that power supply to sort of forcibly balance that grid. That's called load shedding. And there was a lot of that happened in this system. Now, if you only have to shed a little bit of load, typically that happens through something called rolling blackouts. Rolling blackouts, you turn off everybody's power for 30 minutes, but power comes back on, etc. And when the crisis initially happened, February 15th, early morning hours, people thought that's what was going on. That's what I thought was going on.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, wow, wasn't expecting this energy emergency. Now that it's happened, I'm sure the power will come on soon. Yeah. But of course, it didn't. It didn't. And that was because there wasn't enough power to actually even have rolling blackouts. They barely had enough power to serve. They can't turn off power to individual households. They have to do it to sort of neighborhoods. Right. And so they had to continue serving all the critical infrastructure, hospitals, as we'll talk about, natural gas pipelines, power plants, other things like that.
I think that's why I still had power. I think the ER right near my house.
Yeah, if you were next to me in the game. If you were next to a hospital, typically you didn't lose power.
Yep. Interesting. And so ERCOT plays a huge role in that. Are there any other like Texas agencies that have a role in these power emergencies or the forecasting or, a time leading up to one?
Well, ERCOT is the main one in terms of forecasting power demand and in terms of, ensuring that they have the power supply necessary.
Yeah.
However, the Texas Railroad Commission is actually Texas's oil and gas regulator. Yep. You might not know that, but that
not as intuitive of a name as the Electric Reliability Council.
I mean, ironically, Texas Railroad Commission, probably the most important oil and gas regulator in the entire world.
Yep.
And it doesn't have oil and gas in its title. That's our oil and gas regulator. And they're responsible for natural gas production and transport. So ERCOT is responsible for the reliability of the electricity grid, but as we'll discuss, the reliability of the electricity grid, a lot depends on whether our natural gas power plants, which is our principal source of reliable supply, is able to operate during these emergencies, and whether they're able to operate depends on our natural gas production and whether natural gas is getting to the power plants that need it.
Yeah. And so we talked about forecasting and preparing for these things, and that, that falls on these agencies to do. And I know about, I guess a decade prior to this storm in 2011, there was a winter storm, another freeze that froze over most of the Southwest. And there were reports that came out. I know in preparation for this episode, I read one from FERC and NERC that made a bunch of recommendations. And so I guess I just wonder, why do you think ERCOT and maybe the Texas Railroad Commission ignored these reports, or did they, I suppose?
I don't think they ignored the reports, but certainly there wasn't a lot of action in response to them. Yeah. I mean, also, you read FERC, NERC reports, they might have some implications about what they think would be appropriate, but they typically don't say, you must pass this kind of legislation or regulation. It's more, well, here are some of the problems. Here are some potential ways to address them. And I think it is fair to say that ERCOT and the Railroad Commission didn't do very much to address that. And why is that? Well, historically, ERCOT and the Railroad Commission, they don't work very closely together a lot of time. And that's one of the things that we hope is going to change as a result of some of this new legislation. And there's multiple reasons for that. I mean, the railroad commissioners, the 3 railroad commissioners are elected. Okay. So, if you listen to the railroad commissioners, they sometimes sound a little bit more like elected politicians, whereas the board of ERCOT is it was basically a self-sustaining board. Now that process is changing. So they'll be a little bit more politically responsible, maybe having somewhat more similar, although they still won't be elected, but maybe having somewhat more similar amount of political responsibility will lead to closer coordination in the future.
Yeah.
But previously, there just wasn't a whole lot of give and take between those agencies. And I think as the power system has come to become very dependent on natural gas for reliable energy,
right.
I think that really has proven crucial. I mean, it's also important to say 2011, the 2011 power outages weren't nearly as bad as the ones that we had. So I think it's fair to say that people didn't understand the extent of the problem, although they should have, because all the things that made that happen have only gotten more severe in the meantime.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely interested in getting a little bit more into not only the governance changes, but some other changes from the Texas Legislature later in the episode. I guess before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about Winter Storm Uri and what happened actually during that winter storm to kind of cause all this chaos. So Uri was, I believe, the worst natural disaster in Texas history. Over $100 billion in damage, over 100 lives lost, and millions of people without power. And so the big part of all this was, of course, the blackouts. And we've talked about the blackouts a little bit, but what did cause those blackouts more specifically?
It was really two things. The first thing is that no one realized how much power the grid was going to demand. We had a record demand for electricity during this period because we had very cold weather. Now, with that said, we should have known this demand was coming. Texas has continued to grow very rapidly. Texas regularly has very cold storms. This was not unprecedented, pretty similar to the 1989 storm. I mean, Texas throughout its history has always had very cold weather at times. You may not... You're from Massachusetts. I don't know if you get into Texas history, but the whole reason the Alamo didn't fall day one.
I was hoping you'd reference the Alamo because I do. If I know Texas history, there you go.
There you go. Well, so the reason it didn't fall day one is because on the way north to San Antonio, Santa Ana, many of his soldiers froze to death in a blizzard, and his big cannon were stuck and couldn't be moved. And so if he had his big cannon, he could have knocked down the walls day one. The story would have a lot less drama in it than it does and that was south of San Antonio. So all of Texas has always had severe winter weather. Not every year, not every decade.
A few times in history, there's been some pros for it.
Well,
winning.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, exactly. Certainly from the Texan perspective. Yes, absolutely. So in any event, this happens, and we should have known it happens. And really, it seems like ERCOT was planning for 2011 as their worst case scenario, which to me is crazy because 2011 obviously wasn't a worst case scenario. We had much colder weather in 1989. And so I think one reason that the main reason no one knew this was coming is because ERCOT's predictions were totally unrealistic. And I think, now you could say, well, you don't have to take ERCOT's word for it. But the reality is that a lot of power producers, when they're thinking about it, they're not, maybe they don't hire their own meteorological person. They say, well, ERCOT probably knows what it's doing. In this case, it didn't. So that was one big half of the problem is that, they missed by 10 gigawatts of production. Texas peak demand would be 70
is a lot of power,
70 gigawatts. So that is a giant miss. I mean, California on an average day produces 20 gigawatts of power. Okay.
Yeah.
So they missed like half. If you just missed half of California and weren't aware that it was there. I mean, if you make a 10 gigawatt mistake in forecasting, the power is going out, right? At least to some extent. Okay. So that was half the problem.
Okay.
The other half of the problem is that we didn't understand our vulnerability to these kind of cascading power outages.
Yeah.
And really, there were a number of things that happened. I mean, first, I think a lot of, wind turbines froze. People say, oh, we could weatherize wind turbines. And because they do, wind turbines operate in much colder temperatures than Texas. Unclear necessarily if that's worth it, because one of the big problems with wind turbines are great for saving fuel, because basically in good weather, they're typically providing us a lot of really cheap power. That means we don't have to burn as much natural gas. The problem is that when there's really bad weather, when it's really cold, that's typically because a cold front is stuck over Texas. And wind turbines, even if they weren't frozen, are going to provide very little energy. So we're dependent on natural gas, okay? And the reason, in part, we're dependent on natural gas is because natural gas has just taken an outsized role in the U.S. electricity system as we basically moved away from coal and nuclear, and basically we have natural gas plus renewables. That's kind of our model. That's more true in Texas than a lot of other places, in part because Texas has had more rapid population growth. So, in other places, maybe they're still running their old coal power plants or their nuclear power plants, and that covers a lot of the population. In Texas, it's mostly natural gas and renewables. Okay. So that the difficulty with natural gas, of course, is that very hard to store. It's a gas. It's very voluminous. If you were going to store it, it has to be airtight. Typically, it's just not stored. So that means that you have to have a constant supply of natural gas to your power plant to ensure constant power from your power plant. Normally not a problem in Texas. The U.S. is the world's #1 producer of natural gas. Texas is the U.S.'s #1 producer of natural gas. We normally export natural gas. Normally that's fine. But in this storm, we found a number of negative feedback loops that affected natural gas supply and meant our natural gas power plants couldn't provide power. Okay. What were these feedback loops? Well, one, when it's cold, natural gas in the ground shrinks. It's like any gas; it gets smaller when it's cold weather, so it makes it harder to pump out of the ground. That also means the only place that's typically stored is in the ground. So even if you had it stored, it was harder to pump it out.
Okay.
Secondly, how is it pumped to the power plants where it's needed? Well, mostly by pipelines. For environmental reasons, we replaced the pump stations on those pipelines. You might think, why don't they just run on natural gas? Well, for environmental reasons, some of them run on electricity instead. And so if power went out to that pipeline, then there's no pipeline to pump natural gas to the power plant that needs it. And so also pumps in the field. Typically, they run on electricity as well. Now, some of this shouldn't be a problem if ERCOT and the companies do their job and those companies let ERCOT know, so ERCOT knows, don't shut down power to this pipeline or to this neighborhood that includes this pipeline. Don't shut power down to this field where we have natural gas stored or we're pumping natural gas.
Right.
Unfortunately, that there were huge breakdowns in that system.
Okay.
So it turns out that there was, as a company, you had to file a little form with ERCOT that says, I'm critical infrastructure, don't shut down power to me. Many of these companies had not filed this form.
Companies love filing forms.
Many didn't know they existed. The Commissioner Craddock of the Railroad Commission said she didn't know it existed. I mean, and this is a many-sided, this is a huge failure, many-sided failure, because, of course, the companies have got to know this. Like, this is free. This doesn't cost them money. They just need to let ERCOT know, don't shut down my power. Two is that, ERCOT should have known this, because ERCOT needs to have visibility on where is my, these power plants. I'm in charge of making sure that they keep running, but I don't even know where their pipelines are, and I'm apparently shutting down power to that. So that's something ERCOT needs to know. And also the Railroad Commission. The Railroad Commission is the one responsible for ensuring pipeline transport, so they need to know. So really all three of those parties failed going into this, and that's part of the reason we had these cascading outages, is because there were problems in the natural gas supply chain that meant power plants didn't get them. there's a whole variety of other things that just happen when it's cold. You can have cooling water freeze. The actual wells that are producing the oil and gas can freeze up. There's any number of things that can happen. I mean, one thing that's just amazing is that some of these natural gas supply chain parts apparently were signed up for ERCOT's bonus that they pay to you to be able to turn off your power. That is insanity. Okay. But this is, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of time it's surprising how often big companies do this, because the ERCOT or the companies that provide power, we can give an incentive that says, hey, we need to be able to, in a crisis, turn off somebody's power. Yeah. So we're going to give you a break on your electricity for all the time. So you get, you're basically saving money every month in return that we can turn your power off when we need to. Okay. If you're somebody who does, you're in your house and you don't mind if on a hot day in the summer, all of a sudden you can't use your air conditioning. Yeah, that's fine. If you are a critical component of the supply chain that ensures we have power, that is a terrible idea.
That's wild.
But more often than you think, I think there's just some manager is like, oh, we can get a break on our power. What do we have to do to do this?
Where do I
and they're
sign?
like, oh yeah, exactly.
They'll file that form.
And so that's just it's amazing. I mean, there's a lot of
that's incredible.
Kind of amazing incompetence that it's a big state. So there are individual examples of things that just went bizarrely wrong.
Right. So that explains why there were blackouts. But why was there so much damage? Before we continue, a special thanks to our sponsor, Vincent & Elkins, a global law firm with 11 offices and more than 700 lawyers committed to excellence in serving and advising its sophisticated clients in industries such as energy, finance, technology, real estate, media, and beyond. V&E lawyers are also proud to support pro bono clients across their communities. To help clients navigate complex areas of law, V&E hires the best and brightest law students and lawyers, valuing diverse perspectives and backgrounds. Visit www.velaw.com to learn more about V&E's Summer Associate Program and hiring opportunities. Start your success story at Vincent & Elkins. I mean, I think I researched early after they were saying $197 billion in damage. I don't know where the estimate's at now, but it sounds like it's in the hundred of billions. Where did a lot of damage come from?
Well, Texas houses are not made to withstand cold temperatures, and as a Minnesotan or as somebody from Massachusetts, that may be hard to imagine, but often it's just not worth it for a once every 30 or 40 year storm to spend the money to insulate them, protect them from that, etc. So and if your house isn't insulated, well then it could cause huge damage. So I think we were very fortunate not to have any burst pipes, but a lot of people had burst pipes. That can cause incredible damage to a house. And I think this is a very tough one. You could manufacture Texas homes like homes in Minnesota or in Calgary or like in Massachusetts. The problem with that is it costs more. And one of Texas's biggest advantages over every other place, and one of the reasons people want to move here
housing,
is that we still have relatively affordable housing, so it's not costless. And I think there's a number of scholars that would tell you that there may be even an incentive to you mandate something, and that's not a problem for people who are purchasing houses at the top end of the market because it's just a tiny little bit. In addition, they might have wanted it anyway. But for people who are looking for what Texas has to offer, which is affordable housing, it can be a big deal. And so in any event, it's a real tough question. But we're not very insulated. The question, of course, is whether it's worth paying every day for that amount, and sometimes it absolutely is, and there's obviously some instances where people now realize, okay, we have to insulate this, etc. But it's not always the case. I mean, you have a 1 in 40 year storm, yes, it will do some damage.
I don't know. I think I'm assuming the risk. I mean, being from Massachusetts, seeing a bunch of homes that are still built in the early 1900s, late 1800s, because I'm assuming how much they cost. I'd take the potential of a burst pipe and having a home that was built 15 years ago and has all the other nice features that you don't have to worry about. So.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So so that's a really it's a really complicated. The whole there's been some people have said, well, energy efficiency is the way to address this, and I absolutely think there are opportunities for that, but it's really it can be. Those trade-offs can be very difficult to assess. I mean, I always think there's DC's Central Library was, I can't remember which consultancy it was, but if you ever go there, it's a very unattractive building, and I think it was the consultants that had it built were like BCG or something. They said, I can't remember who it was, but in any event, the consultant said, the modern approach to these things, there's no need for windows because you can provide air and ventilation and light much cheaper with fluorescent bulbs or whatever and an HVAC system. And so basically they wanted like a cube, so it's kind of like
a scientist's solution to
life.
Exactly.
Exactly. So sometimes you see these suggestions like, oh, we just never need to open our windows again.
Just don't go outside. Ever.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't open your door, no heat will get out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's and frankly, now we all have to open our windows and run the AC full blast because of the pandemic. So in any event, it's the trade-offs can be very difficult, and I'm not sure that we can make rules that just apply across the spectrum. But there's no doubt that if we had better insulated houses, we would have experienced less harm from the storm.
And so the trade-off makes sense to me, I think, on the housing side. Cheaper houses, keep things newer, keep housing prices down in Texas. But what about weatherizing, especially like those natural gas or pipelines or production areas, those that froze or went down? I mean, we have natural gas in places that aren't warm like Texas. What would it cost to weatherize? What would it cost maybe the companies, but also what would it cost the consumer?
Well, weatherize isn't a defined term, so there's not a price. I mean, it would cost them nothing to submit the form to ERCOT saying, "Hey, don't turn our power off." So if that's what weatherize means, absolutely, we should require it, right? If weatherizing, weatherizing means some level of insulation over key sensors or over key water that is nests can't be frozen. That could make sense too. If weatherizing means methanol injection at every natural gas well in Texas, that there's no way that makes economic sense.
Right.
And so it is a term that's going to have to be defined by the Railroad Commission and by ERCOT, and it could encompass all kinds of costs from very minor to very severe. So I think there's no doubt that there is room to weatherize. I think the way I would think about it is if only a couple things went wrong, you can just mandate that those things are done correctly. And I think we all know at least a couple things that went wrong in this storm that it doesn't even make sense on a cost benefit. You can't sign up for the demand response program, if you're a critical part of the supply chain. B, file this form with ERCOT. We can mandate those things. But to the extent that what went wrong is 5,000 different things, hard to mandate those with regulation. We can add to that list, but ultimately what you want these companies to be thinking about the reliability problem as engineers looking to make a profit. You want them to think they have an incentive to stay open during that time period, so they better stress test their system, think of any problem, because maybe they can probably find those 5,000 things that went out, and they probably have a better idea than you do of every last little thing that went wrong during that storm. So you want them thinking that way. If instead all you have is a checklist of, hey, these are the 5 things you do, they might fix those 5 things.
Right.
That's fine. But that's like, the lawyer, they're asking the lawyer, okay, did I comply? Did I comply? Did I comply? If they don't really care if they're open in that winter storm, there might be 100 different things that go wrong in the next storm. So that's why it's really crucial. I mean, the regulatory part is great, but it's only really going to be effective if you have the incentive as well.
And so, because Texas is a very deregulated energy market, right? What you're saying is the incentive side of things is probably a much better solution than just adding regulation to hope you're, putting Band-Aids on a lot of things when there might be a much bigger wound.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know the precise balance between those things. To the extent I can tell, it seems like this is a situation where we had like 500 different things go wrong at each of the different plants. I mean, the biggest single cause of, people talk about, I didn't have enough fuel. Some places said that. Some places said the frequency of the grid being off tripped me off. But the biggest single thing was just weather related. Well, what does that mean? And that's a million different things.
Solve it.
So to the extent that was the big problem, weather related, then we need incentives to change people's behavior. But to the extent it was, hey, if we can address discrete things, absolutely, that's a great idea. But the problem with the weather related and like the things that we're going to solve by incentives, we may never know like what the problems were at every individual plant and whether they got fixed. The only sign that this is going to be better is that when this next storm comes around, do the lights go off? So in some ways, the regulatory part is a little bit more satisfying because at least you can say, okay, these 5 things, every natural gas pipeline in the state has done them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you talk about all these different things that went wrong, being 10 gigawatts under power production, billions of dollars of damage. How close did we come to a total catastrophe?
Well, very close, very close. And I think sometimes people say we were 4 minutes and 37 seconds away. And what they mean by that, the important point to understand is that it's a runaway process of this feedback loop shutting down the grid.
Right.
That runaway process started to run away, and we were only able to save it by just catastrophic load shedding, cutting off huge number of consumers. What they mean, though, is that if power plants, just because ERCOT is failing its job and the grid is going off the right frequency, power plants aren't really supposed to turn off in that circumstance. But they are allowed to turn off if the grid frequency is below 59.4 for 9 minutes. And so the expectation is it was below 59.4 for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. So the expectation is that if they had hit that standard where they were allowed to turn off, they all would have turned off. I don't know. I mean, and the other idea is that, well, if they had gone off, then everything would have gone off. Again, I'm not sure, but I mean, certainly seems quite plausible. I also wonder if it had even lasted another 2 minutes because so many were already being knocked off and you started to get that chain reaction going, whether the grid would have gone down already because of that. So those counterfactuals are very difficult to address. But I think it's fair to say, we were extremely close, certainly within minutes of the entire grid going down, and we really don't know how long it would have taken to restart things. That's an incredible technical challenge to deal with because if the grid is down, most power plants are not black start capable, so they can't just start from zero. They have to be connected to the grid. And so you have to take the few that are black start capable and then gradually ramp up the grid, constantly demanding how many people are providing power. So you like switch on power just to one neighborhood or one natural gas field or pipeline or et cetera at a time. And you can imagine that's an intricate process that can easily get out of balance. So it would have been a really unprecedented disaster. I mean, it was an unprecedented disaster as is, but it would have been, 10 times that had that happened. 10 times is probably an underestimate.
Incredible. So we've talked about the aftermath in dollars of damage. We've talked about it in terms of losses of life, people out of power. But now I'd like to shift to the aftermath in the courtroom and in particular litigation over Winter Storm Uri. And so what type of lawsuits, what kinds of lawsuits have come out of Uri? Because I've heard there's a lot. I've heard estimates hundreds, maybe more than hundreds.
I'd be shocked if it wasn't over 100. It's more like what kind of lawsuits haven't come from Uri. Because it created a huge number of problems. One thing we haven't discussed, I mean, apart from all the physical consequences of this, the financial consequences, because ERCOT also messed up the financial part of this as well. So the way, remember, as I said, the way it's supposed to work is that they have a little price adder that they add to the price when power is short. Now that goes up to some maximum. There's also a price cap, $9,000 a megawatt hour, higher than anyone else allows. That's just an astronomical price for power. And I mean, if the whole point is to provide an incentive to be open to be operating during those crunch periods, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it should be even higher. But that's sort of the way Texas has reasoned about it. That's why they set such a astronomically high price cap.
Yeah.
Okay. So remember, I said ERCOT actually, it's not like ERCOT sitting there with a whiteboard figuring out what the price should be. They have a computer that does it. And it says, it spits out a price and it says, okay, these ones should operate because they're the ones, they're the most affordable ones operating. So what happened during this storm is that ERCOT, the way it operates is if it sees that there's spare capacity, it lowers the price. It says, oh, we've got more power than we need. We can lower the price. But when ERCOT started ordering companies to turn off the power to customers, all of a sudden there was extra power, right? Like they weren't necessarily using all the power in the system. And so the computer that ERCOT uses to price said, oh, we're back to normal conditions, and started lowering the price. And so at that point, everybody is kind of flabbergasted. No, there are millions of Texans that don't have power that are freezing right now.
Yeah.
The price should be high to induce people to produce power if they at all can, particularly because we were seeing huge rise in natural gas prices at the same time. So power plants, ERCOT was really telling power plants to shut down even when we needed power most because of this, because that's how their computer was assessing the circumstance.
Right.
Now, you might say, how did ERCOT fail to have their computer calibrated so that when they were forced to shed power, it provided reasonable prices?
Right.
I don't have an answer for you on that, but that was obviously another major failure. But what's the alternative? Because they didn't have like a backup pricing system.
Yeah.
Right. So they couldn't, and they obviously can't sit there with a whiteboard. So what instead happened is the Public Utility Commission, the PUC, which is in charge, which supervises ERCOT, they just mandated a price. Well, what price are you going to mandate? They just mandated the highest price. But remember, again, this is an astronomically high price. Yeah. And they just said, leave it there until we've got everybody power that's asking for it. And so we had these $9,000 megawatt hour prices for 4 days that it led to, for these power providers that have to purchase power from the power producers and then give it to customers, they paid more for energy in a week than they had in the previous 4 years. I mean, it was just astronomical prices. So that has led to all sorts of lawsuits. Yeah. So for those power providers, they basically, some of them have sued ERCOT, and they've said, this. Because remember this example, like what ERCOT's doing with this price adder is kind of like if you went to get gas, you filled up for $4 a gallon, you're grumbling about the price, and then you get back and you get a bill from Conoco saying, by the way, you owe an extra $1 per gallon because this is surge pricing, right? I mean, surge pricing makes us mad enough on Uber. If it was like if it was like imposed by a regulator, we'd be really angry. Okay. Now imagine instead you get a bill that says, just kidding, it wasn't $4 a gallon, it was $50 a gallon. Yeah. And so here's a bill for $46 per extra gallon.
Truly devastating.
Exactly. So, and that's from, the regulator is basically telling you that. I mean, so a lot of people say, well, Texas is a free market system, and it does try to incorporate the free market, but this is the opposite of a free market system, right? This is saying you must purchase something, and this is what you must pay for it, which is you never agreed to pay. Right. So in any event, one thing that those power purchasers and providers did is sued ERCOT.
Okay.
like how, why would you set that, right?
Yeah, can they do that? I mean, is there any sort of immunity that ERCOT gets? Or
Open question. Yeah, so
to be determined. Okay.
Yeah, to be determined.
Yeah.
And I think the answer to almost all these questions is going to be to be determined because there are lawsuits ongoing, and it won't maybe courts will come to inconsistent determinations until we get final rulings.
Yeah.
So then they also sued the natural gas companies that were providing them with natural gas because natural gas isn't even less regulated in terms of the pricing. And so remember, there was a shortage of natural gas. And so that meant that like every node in the natural gas system at the field, from to the power providers, there was an incredible shortage of natural gas. And so what happened with natural gas prices, they spiked to, previously absurd levels. So Texas typically has the lowest priced natural gas in the world. I mean, on a normal day, we flare vast quantities of natural gas. I mean, there's nobody to purchase it, so we just burn it off.
Right.
And in this crisis, we were paying, 10 times more than any other place in the world was paying for natural gas. So there's incredibly high prices for natural gas. So the power providers have also sued the natural gas company, right? So they've done that as well. Then most of the people purchasing, a lot of the people that were required to purchase power haven't paid for that. So then there's typically countersuits. So there are just a plethora of existing lawsuits. There's claims like this price gouging in the natural gas market. That's a very unusual claim because the whole point of energy markets is because they're deregulated. Typically, you have big it's supposed to work with big swings that cause people to invest to ensure reliability. So it is just there are myriad legal questions to resolve. It'll be really interesting.
I mean, but right now, lawsuits get dropped, right? I mean, are there winners and losers from Uri? Like, are some of these natural gas providers currently like way on top? I mean, are people being unjustly benefited from this event?
So generally, people that continued to companies that were able to provide natural gas. I mean, frankly, the companies that did what we wanted to. I mean, so in that sense, I guess the system worked. The system obviously overall did not work, but there was a huge incentive to be able to provide natural gas during this period. So the natural gas companies that continued providing natural gas made insane profits. And so, the system is supposed to provide profit to be available during those peak periods. Now, there's a more complicated issue, which has been raised. It's sort of a lot of times, and there's rhetoric around this that doesn't can be a little bit misleading, but there may be some truth to a narrower claim. So a lot of people will say the natural gas companies failed to provide natural gas and were rewarded for it with higher profits. Okay?
Yep.
Now, that's confusing a couple different things. I mean, imagine because there are companies that failed to provide natural gas that they had contracted to provide that are now liable for huge amounts or can be sued for huge amounts, right? There are also companies that did provide what they were supposed to, and they made a lot of money. Now, if you look at the industry overall, it ended up, I don't have final numbers on this, but let's say it's possible that it ended up making more money overall. Well, in some ways, that's not surprising. Like imagine that you had a city that just had, half of its coffee spots were Starbucks, right? If Starbucks had some my
wife would be in heaven.
Yeah, okay, that's what she likes. Okay. So if Starbucks had like a labor relations disaster and all of them closed, right? That would be a disaster for Starbucks. But the coffee industry in general would make more money because typically the assumption is if the whole industry sells, and it depends on price elasticity, but I assume people want their coffee, right? So if the whole industry sells half as much, prices will rise more than double, right? That certainly would be true with a lot of with electricity, gasoline, a lot of things like that. Like if you cut gasoline sales in the U.S. In half, prices would probably more than double. Okay. So yeah, the industry as a whole ends up more, but that's not a result of coordination. That's just because Starbucks had a bad week or whatever.
Yeah.
And so you're basically acting like something is the same when it's not. Okay. On the other hand, let's say that Starbucks controlled literally every store in the town, right? There was no way to get coffee other than Starbucks. If Starbucks said, oh, shoot, we had labor relations problems at half of our stores. And by the way, because now there's a coffee shortage, we're charging 3 times as much at our other stores. They would make more money. But obviously in that circumstance, they're a monopoly and should be regulated as such.
Right.
Okay. So, one basic question is, the markets were shifting unpredictably during this winter storm. Were there circumstances where there were natural gas suppliers, could be power suppliers as well, but probably natural gas suppliers, that were acting like the Starbucks that just happened to be a monopoly in some local market, or because pipelines were down or otherwise, and realized they were a monopoly and said, shoot, we can't provide as much gas right now, and we're tripling the price on the gas that we have, right? That potentially creates huge that potentially creates huge antitrust issues, et cetera. You could have a lot of issues that potentially arise in that circumstance. I've seen people that imply that occurred.
Okay.
I haven't seen anyone showing that occurred, but I'm not involved in these lawsuits. Maybe the people in lawsuits feel that there's more evidence of that. But so I think it's important to understand when somebody says, oh, the natural gas industry was punished for its own, or was benefited from its own mistakes. Are they talking about different companies? In which case, that's how markets work, right? If one of your competitors falls down, great for you, right? Or are they talking about a single company that basically was claiming it didn't have the ability to provide something, but was acting as a monopolist in that context? And that's something that happened in the California energy crisis, and maybe the suggestion is something similar happened here. But that's that's the kind of thing that will be investigated, litigated, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll be curious to hear how all that turns out. I mean, I'm sure we'll have an answer someday.
Yes,
exactly. The courts
Although,
will speak.
If you look at the California energy crisis and how long it took to get answers in court to some of these questions, it could be a while.
Okay. Well, but something we can talk about that's happening right now, I think, is the Texas Legislature's response to Winter Storm Uri. So they had their legislative session that ended in May, and there were a number of new laws. Some of them went into act or effect immediately. Some of them will go into effect on September 1st. And so I'm curious, I'm sure you know about a lot of these things that are coming in effect, these changes that might, hopefully correct or mitigate some of these issues. What do you believe are some of the most impactful changes that were signed into law?
Well, the biggest single one is the weatherization requirement for these key parts in the supply chain to be weatherized and subject to fines as defined by the Railroad Commission and ERCOT. And I think, to be fair, there's a lot of concern about whether the Railroad Commission and ERCOT did a good job preparing for this one, and so whether they'll do a better job for the next one. And it's certainly my hope that they'll do a better job preparing for the next one, and that they will mandate weatherization to the extent that it makes sense. Now, there's we talked about really 2 ways you can do that. One being with kind of specific mandates, and then the other one is actually with incentives, and really that's kind of that's more of ERCOT's ability to create those potential incentives. Potentially there's kind of like an intermediate where it's more standard, it's not specifically like, insulate this, pressure valve, but we want it, we want evidence that you operate at this, at this temperature or otherwise. That could encompass a number of things. If they find creative ways to do it, that will be interesting. I'm not sure. I think that the main thing is just let's take care of the low-hanging fruit. File the form, your critical infrastructure, et cetera. Okay, so that's important. The fines from that are probably going to be, it's like $1 million a day potentially. Okay. Now, keep in mind, a lot of companies losing $1 billion or gaining $1 billion in days in this storm. So it's significant, but it's not like on the order of the cost that the money that changed hands from the storm significant. Another thing that's going to be very important from this is all these different, action committees that are basically designed to coordinate better between ERCOT and Railroad Commission, identify critical infrastructure so that there's awareness. I mean, it's just no question that this storm caught ERCOT flat-footed. If you can go back and look at their tweets, right? They didn't. I don't think they've deleted any tweets. So what you'll see is that like they were like, oh, it might be a cold storm this weekend. You can save some electricity, etc. There was no indication of how severe it could potentially get. They were definitely caught flat-footed by this, and I think things that they should have realized. The Railroad Commission, in leading up to the storm, was already identifying this as potentially a big issue, and there were already shortages in natural gas that were happening. That should have been a giant red warning light to ERCOT that you might not have natural gas to serve your plants. We're already coming short in terms of our natural gas supply, and they didn't do that. Now, hopefully, if there's more coordination between those agencies, you will have that going forward. That's my hope. But that's a lot of that depends on how these are responsibilities that sort of existed and things we've tasked these agencies with before, and they just haven't done a good job of that. And the question is, is there renewed focus on that actually leads to some follow through? And I'm hopeful there will be. The other thing that comes out of this is because there's been a number of bankruptcies I should have mentioned in the lawsuits as well, and so the Texas Legislature basically. There's going to be a lot of debts that just simply aren't paid. The way ERCOT typically works is if somebody can't pay, everybody pays to the extent of their participation in the grid. And so anyway, we're all going to end up paying for this to some extent, and that I think that was unavoidable. But that's where we are. So you'll see that basically passed on in bill. It's like securitized. They can be paid over a long period of time, and they'll be passed on bills.
We all, you mean like
anybody
us,
who pays
the
for
taxpayers,
for
the
power.
consumers?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's gonna happen, but I think that was unavoidable. So anyway, I think those are the let's see how they go forward on weatherization. Let's see how they go forward on coordination. Right. I think some people are concerned with the changes to ERCOT's board because they'd say, before it was more independent, and now, it basically gets appointed by this committee in consultation with the governor, lieutenant governor, et cetera. My hope for that is that, sometimes we'd say, we'd rather have an agency be independent than political, but there's nothing more political than the Railroad Commission, and so maybe if these actors are a little bit more willing to act hand in hand, that would be beneficial. I mean, within days of the storm, we had very, very combative statements from the Railroad Commission and ERCOT, basically pointing fingers at each other. And if it would be great if there was a little bit more coordination, and maybe that will be possible with a new system. But we'll see. Yeah. I mean, you could imagine it. You could worry, we won't get as much expertise if it's more political system or otherwise. So we'll see.
Also on the expertise side or the governance side, I mean, I think one other change that I saw that kind of caught my eye was they were limiting membership to only people that I think lived in Texas. I mean, what are the downsides and upsides to that? Do we have a lot of people that weren't in Texas for the storm, but were calling the shots?
Yes, and I may get the number wrong, but I think it was 5 of the members were not from Texas. I mean, look, there's great expertise outside of Texas in this issue. So I personally don't think it's a huge benefit to cut off non-Texans. Right. However, there's a lot of expertise in Texas, so I don't think you'll fail to find
and housing's cheap, as we've said. You can bring those people back.
Yeah,
they can come move here. There's plenty of room.
Exactly. Although who knows? Who really wants to be in charge of ERCOT now? I mean, it seemed that they were very quick. The out-of-state members were very quick to resign, and I think they were happy to wash their hands of the circumstance when they saw how bad it was going to be. We also lost all the members of our PUC. So anyway, it is a So I know I don't favor that change. At the same time, I think that there's plenty of expertise in
Sure.
Texas. I don't think, frankly, Texas is, if you had talked to me in, February 1 of last year, and you had surveyed energy policy wise, who has the best energy regulation system in the world, there are a lot of people that would have said Texas. And so, Texas is a very closely watched electricity market. Yeah. Basically, there's sort of traditional regulation states where the government just determines how much they can charge, and there's like a single utility for each area. There are systems that are like Texas's, but they also include a payment to power plants just to stay open and ready to run.
Right.
Those are called capacity systems. Texas is an energy-only market, which is, I think, a lot of people see as a big advantage. There are other places that have done that, like Alberta, some in Australia. So there are potentially, so a lot of people look to it as a potential model. So it's not like, people like, why is this Californian really interested in Texas's energy market? Why is this person from Massachusetts really interested in Texas's energy market? In fact, there's a lot of people who are fascinated by it and want to make sure it works well. So I think it's too bad, but I don't think it's, I've no doubt they'll be able to, if they want to, find, very qualified members here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I wanted to touch a little bit because you've mentioned a lot in the lead up here that it seemed like communication and coordination was a bit of an issue, especially between like the Railroad Commission and ERCOT, and the Texas legislators created numerous like committees or councils. Like we got the Energy Reliability Council, like the Supply Chain and Mapping Committee, the Energy Plan Advisory Committee, and it sounds like these committees could solve a lot of these communication errors or mapping errors, but are these organizations going to have enough resources to be able to accomplish all of this? Because I've worked for the government in the past, and that's normally something that comes up a lot, right? I'm sure that's what these like ERCOT and the Railroad Commission might have said, right?
Well, I think that's a to be determined, right? I mean, there was, certainly, there was a lot of planned follow up from the 2011 blackouts that really kind of petered out and really didn't lead to much. So, so we're gonna have to see going forward, and I personally very interested to see what happens this winter. And we got lucky with a reasonably mild summer here in Texas.
So we still got some warnings.
Yeah, exactly. We still got some warnings. We got some warning in the spring and gorgeous weather.
Yeah.
There is definitely and it's going to take a while for even the good changes that were passed here to take hold. So anyway, I hope that this isn't kind of lost like the 2011 one. I find it hard to believe it would be given the scale of the catastrophe that unfolded.
Sure.
But we really have to see. We really have to see, and we really won't. We won't know except for after a couple of years when we look at that. Are the agencies working better together? Do we have reports on what is our complete our infrastructure, et cetera? I mean, one thing that I kind of suggested in response is I would encourage all of you, if you're interested, if you live in Texas or if you're interested in ERCOT, ERCOT has a great app. For all the failures during the storm, they have a great app with a lot of information.
I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah. And it was very helpful to me during the storm because there was a lot of happy talk. Oh, the power's going to be coming back on, but you would see those green and orange lines approaching each other, which was the amount of power that was available and the amount of power that was being demanded. And every time they got close, the lights would go out.
Interesting.
So I think I would love to see that level of transparency with our natural gas system as well. Like, could we know, how much natural gas is happening right now? Because increasingly that is crucial to the reliability of our power supply. And, I think one of the things that could definitely be improved on, and I hope will be, by ERCOT is simply their communication in this crisis.
Sure.
There wasn't just to the people who needed power, not just to the power providers. They didn't get the information they needed. But as, ERCOT wasn't explaining, this is not rolling blackouts. Your power is not coming back on. That didn't happen for days. There was a lot, and that was crucial information because if the power was coming back on, you could stay in your house. But maybe if the power wasn't coming back on,
you're driving to a relative's house.
Yes,
or you're
exactly. And these were decisions that were critical to your safety that were not communicated. And so I think that even though as I said, ERCOT is a good app. they need to up their game in terms of their communication, not just to the energy industry, but also to consumers. And I would say the same thing is true of the Railroad Commission. I mean, the Railroad Commission, again, world's most important oil and gas regulator. They just redid their website, but it really, for how important they are to the world's energy system, they should be producing information to the public at a different level.
That's very interesting. I was going to ask you what you think should still be changed. I think you've already answered it, and I agree with you. It's really interesting to think back and think about how you're just kind of lost. You had no idea, and I'm sure somebody knew, right? Somebody could have explained that to us, and my phone still worked. So the cell towers didn't go down.
I worry that nobody knew. I worry that I think there was a vast amount of confusion from all the players in the system, and that is what a lot of the post interviews suggest. It's a little scary sometimes when you realize, surely there's somebody controlling this. And then no, there's not. Nobody knows the answer to these questions.
Yeah. James, thank you so much for being on the show. I have two closing questions one of them's a little less Winter Storm Uri focus, and that is, where can people go to find more or hear more from at Energy Law Prof?
Well, that's one hint. Which you go on Twitter. I'm at Energy Law Prof on Twitter. You can also see my blog, which is the Energy Law Prof blog. So it's just energylawprof.com. I have a YouTube channel, also Energy Law Prof, where I discuss some of these things. And then along with some professors at Texas, University of Colorado, Vanderbilt, South Carolina, I run the Energy Trade-Offs website, which is where we talk with a bunch of interdisciplinary experts on some kind of questions of, the trade-offs between economic, environmental, performance, reliability in the energy system. So you can definitely check out. I'd be happy to connect with any of you that way.
Excellent. Definitely check that out. And as my final question, we've talked about a storm that happened a decade ago where there was a response, where things were noticed. And then we've talked today about the Texas Legislature's response to Winter Storm Uri. How much hope do you have that in maybe this winter or in the next major freeze, things will be different?
Well, I'm very hopeful that things will be at least a little better if we had this. But we haven't had enough time, frankly, to prepare our system if we really have a storm that's as bad this winter. So I'm just hopeful that we'll have a little bit milder winter. I mean, as we said, as a Minnesotan, actually after the first day, the weather outside was fine by me. I thought it was an interesting contrast between inside, where it felt apocalyptic. The house was like settling, like it was going to explode. I was worried my pipes were going to explode, and you take a walk outside, it was beautiful. But so I'm hopeful that we'll have a milder winter this winter, and that'll give us some space that in the next couple of years our power plants will be better prepared, and our whole energy supply chain system to deal with this challenge. I'm sure we'll make some improvement, but we need to, as we've discussed, make a just drastic leap of an improvement. And I think that really remains to be seen. It's going to take continuing attention to something that, frankly, we often don't want to pay attention to, which is the energy system. You just want it to work without thinking about it, and without it costing you so much that you think about it. But I think one thing that we've learned is we're going to have to think about it. There's a lot of great things about the energy system in Texas. We have a lot of renewable power. We have a lot of natural gas, which burns cleanly. So we have a very high environmental performance from our system. Historically, it's been very cheap, and historically, until last winter, it was pretty reliable. And so I'm hopeful that we can get there again, but it's going to take work.
Well, fingers crossed. Maybe invest in a generator. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, James. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. This was fun. Let's do it again.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you heard, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, and follow the Houston Law Review on social media, or check us out on HoustonLawReview.org. Till next time.